In 1919, a single clause buried deep in the Treaty of Versailles demanded Germany pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations. That's over $500 billion today. But the money didn't exist. Not in Berlin, not in Paris, not even in London. Germany hadn't lost the war alone, but it would be made to pay alone. On paper, the demand was economic justice. In reality, it was financial sabotage on a continental scale. Because behind the treaty's legal language lay something more dangerous, an invisible arithmetic that no country could survive. The Allies needed money. France had lost a generation. Britain was drowning in war bonds. The United States? It wanted its loans repaid. The entire continent stood on a cracked foundation, a war fought on credit and peace signed in debt. But here's the paradox. The more Germany paid, the poorer Europe became. The more they demanded gold, the less they had to trade. Currency collapsed. Capital fled. Inside 2 years, the German mark became worthless. Hyperinflation followed like a flood. And the gold? It flowed not to France or Britain, but across the Atlantic. Some historians believe the treaty's authors misunderstood money. Others say they knew exactly what they were doing. The truth is colder. They designed a system with no escape route, no clause for mercy, no formula for stability, just extraction. And now imagine this, a defeated economy forced to pay its enemies by destroying its own currency, while those enemies borrowed the same money from a neutral creditor, a triangle of debt, bleeding value at every point. What does that mean? It means Versailles wasn't just a treaty, it was a transfer of blame, of capital, of collapse. The war had ended on the battlefield, but its economics had only just begun. If this opened another side of history for you, comment where you're watching from. To understand how a treaty could bankrupt a continent, we need to return to Europe in the final months of World War I. Autumn 1918. 4 years of industrial warfare had drained every treasury. Nations weren't just exhausted, they were insolvent. Britain had borrowed over £1.3 billion, much of it from the United States. France owed even more. Germany had financed its war almost entirely through internal debt, short-term war bonds sold to its own citizens under patriotic slogans. None of the major powers had raised enough taxes to cover their costs. Why? Because taxes are slow. War is not. Instead, they printed money. They borrowed. They promised. The continent was living on a credit line extended by optimism and desperation. And when the fighting stopped, the bills came due. But war debt wasn't just about numbers. It was political. The Allies believed, or convinced themselves, that Germany's defeat meant it had to pay for everything. Not just its own destruction, but theirs too. The logic was clear. You caused this war, you will pay for it. This was the backdrop to the negotiations at Versailles. In January 1919, delegates from 32 countries gathered outside Paris in the Palace of Versailles. The setting was symbolic. The message was not subtle. The German delegation wasn't even allowed in the room where the real decisions were made. The winners would dictate. The loser would sign. Leading the process were 3 men: British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. Together they were called the Big Three. Each came with different goals. Wilson wanted peace without vengeance, but also repayment of America's loans. Lloyd George sought to protect British trade and satisfy a public demanding German punishment. Clemenceau wanted security and revenge. What united them was this: Germany would pay. But how much? And how? At first, even the negotiators didn't know. The treaty left the exact amount of reparations to be determined later. That wasn't indecision, it was strategy. It allowed the Allies to force Germany to accept full financial responsibility without committing to a fixed figure. That clause, Article 231, became infamous, the War Guilt Clause. A simple sentence, assigning all blame to Germany and its allies. It was the legal cornerstone for all future payments. But it wasn't just legal, it was psychological. Germany's entire economy was now chained to a single concept: guilt. This guilt had to be priced. In 1921, that price was set: 132 billion gold marks. It was a number larger than Germany's entire annual GDP, and it had to be paid in gold, coal, timber, ships, and other commodities. Not paper money, not promises. Hard value. Germany protested. Economists warned. John Maynard Keynes, a British delegate at Versailles, resigned in frustration. In his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, he predicted the treaty would ruin Germany and destabilize Europe. But his warnings were ignored. The political momentum was too strong. Newspapers demanded reparations. Parliaments voted for them. Populations wanted compensation. No one wanted to hear that economic punishment could become geopolitical suicide. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America was transforming into the world's new creditor. It hadn't suffered destruction on its soil. Its economy had grown during the war. It now held the financial leverage to influence Europe's recovery, or its collapse. And so, by 1920, a paradox emerged. Europe needed German payments to repay U.S. loans, but Germany could only pay if it borrowed, often from American banks. Money flowed in a circle, growing thinner at each turn. The system looked stable on the surface. In truth, it was already cracking. The treaty hadn't just ended a war. It had embedded a financial time bomb into the heart of the post-war order. And no one was prepared for what would happen when it started ticking. If this gave you a clearer view of the foundations, let me know where you're watching from. The crisis didn't begin with an explosion. It began with a payment request. In June 1921, the Reparations Commission delivered its final bill: 132 billion gold marks, payable over decades. Germany was expected to make its first significant installment, 2 billion marks, immediately. But it couldn't. The war had wrecked its economy. Industrial output had collapsed by nearly half. Exports were limping. Foreign currency reserves were depleted. And gold? Nearly gone. So Germany paid with what it had: coal, timber, and printed money. This was the first structural crack, because printed money is not value. It's a promise, a placeholder. And when you print it faster than your economy grows, you dilute every mark already in circulation. Berlin began printing. At first, it seemed manageable. Inflation crept. Prices doubled, then tripled. But wages lagged. Savings thinned. And reparations demands didn't pause. The Allies saw inflation not as a German problem, but a German tactic, a way to evade real payment. So in 1923, when Germany defaulted on timber deliveries, France and Belgium acted. They invaded the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, and seized assets by force: coal, steel, trains. Their goal was simple: take what hadn't been paid. Germany responded with passive resistance. Workers were told not to cooperate. The government continued paying their wages with printed marks, but now the printing press ran day and night. Hyperinflation began. Prices doubled every few days. By November 1923, one US dollar equaled over 4.2 trillion German marks. A loaf of bread cost billions. People carried wages in suitcases. Children played with worthless banknotes. The middle class, once the backbone of society, was vaporized. Pensions evaporated. Savings turned to dust. Civil servants, teachers, shopkeepers, all impoverished overnight. And through it all, reparations were still due. France continued extracting coal. Britain watched uneasily.
And America increasingly became the silent creditor behind the curtain. But here's the paradox. The more Germany printed, the more worthless its currency became, and the less it could pay in real terms. So it printed more. A monetary death spiral. And yet, from a certain angle, this spiral was profitable, just not for Germany. As inflation skyrocketed, foreign investors bought up German assets at absurd discounts. Factories, land, infrastructure, for cents on the dollar. American capital entered quietly, often through intermediaries. France took physical goods. Britain secured trade deals. The treaty hadn't just drained Germany, it opened it for fire sale. Some economists at the time warned, this isn't punishment, it's destabilization. But the political system couldn't reverse course. To admit the policy had failed would mean admitting the treaty itself was flawed. That was unthinkable. Meanwhile, Germany's society fractured. Extremist movements rose, first on the left, then rapidly on the right. The currency crisis had become a legitimacy crisis. The state was failing in its most basic function, protecting the value of its own money. And here's the insight most missed at the time. Hyperinflation wasn't just an economic event. It was psychological warfare against a nation's sense of future. Because when money loses meaning, contracts collapse. When savings disappear, trust vanishes. And when trust goes, politics radicalizes. The Treaty of Versailles hadn't created Hitler, but it built the scaffolding. And the damage didn't stop at Germany's borders. In 1924, the Dawes Plan restructured Germany's reparations, but not out of mercy. The hyperinflation had spooked American bankers. They needed a stable debtor. So Germany was given new loans, mostly from the US, to help pay back the US. The triangle of debt tightened. Germany borrowed from Wall Street to pay reparations to France and Britain, who in turn used those payments to repay their own debts to Wall Street. It was elegant, it was fragile, and it was doomed, because a system built on circular debt can only last as long as belief does. If this helped you connect the economic dots, let me know where you're watching from. To see how Versailles bankrupted Europe, we have to study the engine beneath it, the debt triangle. At one corner stood Germany, the defeated debtor. At another, France and Britain, the recipients of reparations, but themselves debtors to the third corner, the United States. 3 points, one flow of money. But no surplus, no reserve, just recycling. Germany's obligation was fixed, 132 billion gold marks, but the actual payments were scheduled yearly, often between 2 to 2.5 billion marks. The problem? Germany couldn't earn that through trade. Tariffs were high, industry broken, and trust gone. So it borrowed. American banks, sensing opportunity, offered loans. Between 1924 and 1929, more than $2.5 billion flowed into Germany from the US. Private capital, not government aid. These loans funded reparation payments, which were then routed to Britain and France, who used the money to service their own war debts to the same American banks. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a liquidity trap. Money didn't circulate to grow industry or build infrastructure. It cycled to service interest. And interest compounds. Each turn of the triangle drained a little more. And with each drain, national budgets became more brittle. Now look closer at Germany's internal mechanism. In theory, reparation payments were to come from budget surplus, but Germany had none. Taxes weren't enough. Industrial exports were too weak. So what did Berlin do? It taxed working Germans, while borrowing in dollars to make up the rest. The result was predictable. Growing debt, rising unemployment, and a widening gap between state obligations and private solvency. Debt is an invisible battery. When overcharged, it doesn't explode, it leaks. France, meanwhile, had its own design. It insisted reparations be paid in hard goods, coal, timber, machinery, physical value. France used these deliveries to rebuild northern regions devastated by trench warfare, but even this created imbalance. German coal was sold below market rates, undercutting British producers. British miners went on strike. Economic solidarity among allies frayed. And in Britain, a different issue emerged: gold. Under the pre-war gold standard, currencies were backed by gold reserves. But by 1925, when Britain tried to return to the gold standard at the old exchange rate, its economy wasn't strong enough to support it. The pound became overvalued, exports collapsed, and deflation set in. Why did Britain return to gold? To protect the financial center in London, to preserve prestige. But it locked the country into a rigid system, just as Germany was doing the same under American debt. In effect, Europe had built a structure with no elasticity. Currency flows were rigid, gold stocks were inadequate, and any shock, political, financial, or industrial, would ripple through the entire triangle. That shock came in 1929. The U.S. stock market crashed. American banks froze credit. German banks, starved of liquidity, began collapsing. Reparations stalled. Britain and France defaulted on war debts. The triangle cracked. And the mechanism, praised for its elegance just months before, was now exposed as a global liability. Here's the core irony. The system worked only so long as it didn't have to. Once stress-tested, its architecture, debt-fueled reparations, politically mandated transfers, private capital dependence, collapsed under its own logic. The treaty had embedded these mechanics, but no clause accounted for contraction. No formula included the word crisis. And so a continent designed for recovery was instead primed for synchronized collapse. If this gave you clarity on how money systems can betray their creators, tell me where you're watching from. By the early 1930s, the illusion was over. The Triangle of Versailles had collapsed, and it dragged Europe with it. The first crack came in Germany. After the 1929 crash, American loans dried up. Short-term debts were recalled. Banks, already fragile, began to fail. In 1931, Donut Bank, Germany's second largest, collapsed. It wasn't just a financial institution, it was a signal. Capital fled, credit froze, trade halted. The Weimar Republic, already politically unstable, now faced a total economic breakdown. Industrial production fell by over 40%. Unemployment passed 6 million. 1 in 3 Germans had no job, no savings, and no trust in democracy. The streets radicalized. Elections became battlegrounds. In July 1932, the Nazi Party became the largest in parliament. But this wasn't just a German tragedy. The failure was systemic. France, still relying on reparations, had built its recovery on a false foundation. When the payments stopped, its budget cracked. The franc came under pressure. Political instability followed. 11 governments changed between 1932 and 1935. Britain, trying to defend the pound under the old gold standard, suffered massive capital outflows. In September 1931, it abandoned gold. The currency devalued. But by then, trade had already collapsed. Exports dropped by a quarter. The empire tightened. Across Eastern Europe, the effects were sharper. Austria's Kreditanstalt, the largest bank in Central Europe, collapsed in 1931. Its failure spread panic. Hungary, Romania, the Balkans all saw debt defaults, currency crashes, and political drift toward authoritarianism. Small states, built after the war, began to crumble economically before they ever matured politically. Reparations, in theory, had been a tool for justice. In practice, they became a lever for destruction. The system produced no winners. The United States, while temporarily enriched by loan interest and gold inflows, found itself entangled in global collapse. Trade barriers rose, protectionism spread. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, passed in 1930, triggered retaliations. Global trade contracted by 60% in 4 years. And in the middle of this storm stood the Treaty of Versailles, not as a document of peace, but as a blueprint for shared failure. Some still argue the treaty was harsh but necessary. Others say it was merely mismanaged. But the results are measurable. Germany's middle class was erased. France's recovery was reversed. Britain's financial system lost credibility. Eastern Europe was destabilized. The global economy entered a decade-long depression. More than money was lost. Confidence in liberal institutions evaporated. Democracy itself was discredited, seen as weak, indecisive, corrupted by invisible debts. And this, perhaps, is the deeper cost. Not the gold marks or the bonds, but the vacuum they left behind. A political void, waiting to be filled by extremism, violence, and revenge. Versailles didn't just fail economically. It undermined the very idea of post-war order. Because when systems punish faster than they rebuild, they don't create peace. They delay the next catastrophe. If this reframed what consequences really mean, let me know where you're watching from. Today, there are no war reparations between states, no treaties demanding coal shipments or gold-backed transfers, and yet the mechanisms that broke Europe after 1919 are still very much alive, just rebranded. Then it was Versailles, today, sovereign debt. Let's begin with a simple pattern. Debt, default, conditional aid, austerity, instability. Sound familiar? After the 2008 financial crisis, Greece, a member of the Eurozone, found itself unable to repay its obligations. Its debt to GDP ratio had crossed 130%. Investors panicked. Yields spiked. The government faced a choice: default or accept external intervention. In came the Troika, the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission. They offered loans, not gifts. In return, structural reforms, budget cuts, tax increases. This wasn't war reparations, but it followed the same flow. Greece had to dismantle pensions, cut wages, and sell state assets to keep receiving the money it needed to stay afloat. Meanwhile, capital fled. Youth unemployment passed 60%. Public services crumbled. Trust in institutions evaporated. Sound familiar? Versailles had imposed external obligations on a weakened economy under the theory that payment would restore balance. The result? Hyperinflation, collapse, and radicalization. A century later, technocratic austerity achieved similar outcomes, minus the physical occupation. And here's the kicker. Most of the Greek bailout funds didn't stay in Greece. According to data from the European Court of Auditors, up to 90% of the bailout money flowed back to foreign creditors, primarily German and French banks. Then it was coal and gold, now it's bond yields and interest. Let's widen the lens. Argentina, Lebanon, Sri Lanka. Dozens of nations caught in a cycle of debt dependency. External loans used to stabilize budgets, which must then be repaid by cutting the very social programs needed for recovery. A loop of extraction masked as rescue. These are not conspiracies, they are incentives. Financial systems reward short-term compliance, not long-term sovereignty. Credit ratings punish default risk, not public well-being. Markets react to confidence, not justice. In 1923, Germany printed money to meet obligations it could never fulfill. In 2023, some governments cut education and healthcare to meet fiscal targets they didn't design. The substance changed, the structure did not. And then there's the role of the creditor. In the 1920s, the United States lent freely, then demanded repayment. When collapse came, it pulled back, triggering global deflation. Today, global credit markets are once again centralized, this time around institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and dominant central banks. When rates rise, capital retreats. The periphery breaks first. Exactly as it did in 1931. Here's the pattern. When financial flows are controlled externally, domestic sovereignty becomes conditional. Democracies are hollowed from the inside, not by tanks, but by spreadsheets. And yet the logic persists. We still treat debt as moral, deficit as shame, austerity as discipline. But history shows otherwise. Versailles demanded repayment that destroyed capacity. Modern systems often do the same, dressed in neutral language, enforced by algorithms, executed without elections. Because the deepest echo of 1919 is not the treaty itself. It's the belief that balance sheets can solve political problems, that numbers can discipline nations. But debt is not just arithmetic, it's architecture, It shapes futures. And when the design is flawed, the collapse is shared. If this made the past feel disturbingly current, let me know where you're watching from. Germany paid until it collapsed. Europe collapsed trying to make it pay. A century later, the tools have changed. The logic hasn't. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just end a war. It launched a financial architecture with no pressure valves, no room for failure, no understanding of fragility. That same architecture exists today, not as treaties, but as systems, not as guilt, but as obligation. And still, it punishes weakness with interest and crisis with conditionality. Still, it rewards those who lend, not those who rebuild. Still, it confuses payment with peace. History doesn't repeat, it recalibrates. Each time with smoother mechanisms, cleaner documents, quieter consequences.
But if you trace the flows, the pressure points, the imbalance, you'll find that Versailles was not an end, it was a prototype. And maybe the real legacy of 1919 is that we still haven't broken the loop. If that landed with you, share where you're watching from.